There once was a poor country man whose only inheritance to his 3 sons was his farm, his donkey, and his cat. The eldest son inherited the farm, the second eldest the donkey, and the youngest son inherited the cat. "What on earth will I do with a cat? I can barely feed myself," said the youngest son. "Let alone how can I offer this pet anything? I have no money and am so poor." "Don't worry," said the cat. "If you can get me a sack and a pair of boots, you will see I am the most valuable thing your father ever owned." The son brought the cat what he asked for, as he knew he had nothing to lose. The cat put on the boots and took the sack to catch a plump rabbit. The cat wore the boots on his journey. He would be called Puss in Boots. He caught a plump rabbit and brought it to the king. Puss in Boots told the king the plump rabbit was a gift from his master, the Duke of Carabas. For several weeks, Puss in Boots brought the king many gifts from his master. The king was very curious about Puss in Boots and his master, the Duke of Carabas. But the king knew that the Duke was friendly and had the most well-behaved cat he had ever met. The king did not know that Puss in Boots had made up the name Duke of Carabas for his poor master. One day, the king and his daughter were riding in their carriage by the river. Puss in Boots told his master to take off his pants and shirt and jump in the river. His master agreed to do so. Then Puss in Boots yelled out, "Help! Help! The Duke of Carabas is drowning!" as the king's coach passed by him. The king ordered his driver to stop, and he told his guards to rush over and save the Duke of Carabas. The king saw Puss in Boots yelling and knew he must help him, as he had been so generous to the king. Puss told the king the Duke's clothes had been stolen. So the king offered the Duke a fine suit of his own clothes to put on. The Duke of Carabas got in the carriage for a ride. The king's daughter quietly told the Duke he looked very handsome. The Duke looked at her and told her she was very beautiful. Along the way, Puss had asked all the farmers and workers on the road, "If the king drives by, you must tell him the owner of all these lands is the Duke of Carabas, or the ogre who lives in the castle will eat you." All the farmers and workers answered when asked that the Duke of Carabas was their landowner when the king asked them. Puss in Boots ran ahead to the ogre's castle and asked the ogre about the trick he could do by changing into a small mouse from a big ogre. Puss in Boots told the ogre no one believed he could do a trick like that. The ogre said, "Watch me," as he turned into a small little mouse. Puss in Boots grabbed the mouse and ate it up, and that was the end of the big bad ogre. Just then, the king's carriage arrived at the castle gate. Puss in Boots ran to meet the carriage and said, "Welcome to the castle of the Duke of Carabas." His master could not believe what was happening. On the long ride in the carriage, he had fallen in love with the king's daughter. And Puss in Boots had planned everything to work out perfectly. The Duke asked the king if he could marry his daughter. And the king said, "Yes, of course." The Duke of Carabas and the princess were married and lived happily ever after in their castle. Puss in Boots was named a great lord and never had to hunt for mice ever again. Puss in Boots proved he was the best inheritance, as he had promised his master. Once upon a time, there was a little girl who lived in a village by a forest. Whenever she went out, she wore a red hooded cape. Everyone called her Little Red Riding Hood. One day, her mother baked some cakes, and she asked Little Red Riding Hood to take them to her grandmother, who lived in the forest. Little Red Riding Hood was very excited and happy to go visit her grandmother. Her mother packed up the cakes in a basket and reminded Little Red Riding Hood to not waste time and go straight to her grandmother's house and to not talk to strangers. Along the path to her grandmother's house, there were flowers, ponds, and woodland animals along the way. And Little Red Riding Hood took her time and enjoyed them all. Then, all of a sudden, a wolf was beside her, asking, "Well, Little Red Riding Hood, what are you doing here?" She told him she was on her way to visit her grandmother's house in the forest. The wolf wanted to gobble up Little Red Riding Hood, but he noticed a woodcutter coming along. So the wolf thought of a plan. "Well, where does your grandmother live?" the wolf asked. Little Red Riding Hood answered, "She lives over the bridge and past the lake," she told the wolf. "Let's play a game and race to your grandmother's house to see who can get there first," said the wolf. "Okay," said Little Red Riding Hood as she ran towards her grandmother's house as fast as she could. The wolf knew a secret path that was far quicker and ran towards her grandmother's house to beat Little Red Riding Hood in the race. The wolf knocked on the grandmother's door, and she asked, "Is that you, Little Red Riding Hood?" The wolf was able to disguise his voice very well, and he replied, "Yes, grandmother, it is me." "Oh, come in, my dear Little Red Riding Hood," said grandmother. To her surprise, the big bad wolf ran in and gobbled her up. The wolf then dressed up to disguise himself as the grandmother. He put on her nightcoat and nightcap and jumped in her bed. Very soon after, Little Red Riding Hood knocked on the door. The wolf disguised his voice again and asked, "Who is it?" "It's me," said Little Red Riding Hood. "Oh, do come in, dear," crackled the wolf. When Little Red Riding Hood saw her grandmother, she barely recognized her and thought her voice sounded strange. As Little Red Riding Hood got closer, she noticed her grandmother's ears were so big and asked, "Grandmother, what big ears you have." "All the better to hear you with, my dear," croaked the wolf. "But, grandmother, what big eyes you have." "All the better to see you with, my sweet girl," replied her grandmother, who was really the wolf. "But, grandmother, what big teeth you have," said Little Red Riding Hood, feeling very scared. "All the better to eat you with," roared the wolf as he leapt from the bed towards Little Red Riding Hood. She ran towards the door as fast as she could. And now she could fully see that it was not her grandmother, but the big bad wolf. As she was trying to escape, she yelled, "Help!" in her loudest voice. "Help!" Cutter, who was working in the forest, heard Little Red Riding Hood's cries for help and ran to help her. He caught the big bad wolf and shook him so hard that grandmother came out all in one piece. Little Red Riding Hood hugged her grandmother and apologized for talking to strangers and wasting time. Her grandmother said, "Don't worry, dear. You have learned some important lessons. Now why don't we enjoy those delicious cakes you brought me?" The woodcutter took the big bad wolf deep into the forest, so he could never bother Little Red Riding Hood or her family ever again. The end. All the Whos who lived in Whoville loved Christmas. But the Grinch, who lived just above Whoville, did not. No one knew why the Grinch hated Christmas. Maybe because his head was not screwed on right. His shoes, perhaps, were too tight. But most guessed it was that his heart was 2 sizes too small. Every Christmas Eve, he stood staring down from his cave, hating the Whos so busy below. Planning their Christmas day coming just tomorrow. "I must find a way to stop Christmas from coming," the Grinch growled. He knew if he did not stop Christmas from coming, the children would make so much noise with all their new Christmas toys. And then all the Whos would sit down to their Christmas feast. And after their feast, they did something the Grinch liked the least of all. All the Whos in Whoville would stand close together, with all the Christmas bells ringing. They would stand hand in hand and they would all start singing. "I must stop Christmas from coming." He then got an idea. He made a Santa Claus hat and coat and dressed up just like Saint Nick. He took his dog Max and tied a big horn on his head to make him look like a reindeer. He tied Max to an old sled and loaded some sacks, and they traveled down the mountain towards the town of Whoville. The Whos were all sleeping on this night before Christmas. But as they lay asleep, the Grinch slithered down chimneys and he took all the stockings and all the presents. He then went to the fridge to take all the Whos' feast. He took the Who pudding and even the roast beast. He took all the extras and even their last can of Who hash. He then took all the stuff and threw it up the chimney with glee. And then he even stuffed up the tree. He then heard a small sound and turned to see little Cindy Lou who was not more than 2. She asked the Grinch, "Santa Claus, why are you taking our Christmas tree?" The Grinch thought up a lie and told Cindy Lou a light was broken and he was taking the tree to his workshop. Then he would return the tree all fixed up. Cindy Lou smiled and went back to bed. He then stuffed the tree up. He even took a crumb so there was nothing even for a mouse. He did the same thing to every Who house and then packed up his sled. He raced to the top of Mount Crumpet where he would dump all the Who's Christmas goodies. He grinned as he thought of all the Who's waking up and crying boo-hoo. The Grinch put his hand to his ear to listen to the Who's boo-hooing. What he did hear was quite a surprise. He heard the Who's singing. Every Who was singing, even without all their presents. The Grinch had not stopped Christmas at all. The Grinch then realized Christmas does not come from a store. He then realized Christmas is so much more. And what happened then in Whoville, they say, is that the Grinch's small heart grew 3 sizes that day. And the minute his heart grew, he raced back towards Whoville with all the presents and toys and all the food for the feast. The Whos of Whoville greeted him with open arms and invited the Grinch to their Christmas feast. And as the Grinch sat beside Cindy Lou Who, he carved the roast beast. The end. Once upon a time in the North Pole lived Santa Claus. He lived in a castle with Mrs. Claus and the elves. His reindeer all lived with Santa in the North Pole. One night, a special reindeer named Rudolph was born. Rudolph was special because he had a glowing red nose. Rudolph was not too sure about his nose. It didn't look like all the other reindeers' noses. He heard the other reindeer making fun of his nose. This made Rudolph very sad. Rudolph had no idea that someday his nose would make him very proud. Rudolph left his village and met some great friends along the way. One of his friends was an elf that was always made fun of by the other elves. The elf, named Hermie, just wanted to be a dentist. But all the other elves were toy makers, and they always laughed at Hermie for wanting to be a dentist. Hermie and Rudolph had a lot in common and decided they would head out into the woods to get away from all the people who made fun of them. Soon enough, they saw the scary, abominable snowman. They managed to run away. They met a great adventurer named Yukon Cornelius, and he helped them to fight off the abominable snowman.
Oh. Oh.
They all became very friendly on their journey. They visited the land of misfit toys. The toys asked them for help someday when they got back to Santa. The toys just wanted Santa to help them get to the children. The toys would feel loved once they were in the children's hands. Rudolph, Hermie, and Yukon promised they would help the misfit toys if they could someday. Then it hit, the biggest snowstorm the North Pole had ever seen. It was Christmas Eve and Santa was very close to calling off Christmas because he could not get through the terrible storm to deliver the gifts to the children. Meanwhile, Rudolph, Hermie, Yukon Cornelius, and the abominable snowman were heading back to Santa's castle to get back home from the terrible storm. A whole year had passed since they had left, and they must return home. When they all arrived at Santa's castle, everyone was so happy to see that Rudolph and Hermie were okay. They were all very sorry for being so mean to them and making fun of them. They also enjoyed meeting their brand new friends, Yukon Cornelius and the abominable snowman. Santa all of a sudden realized that Rudolph's bright glowing red nose could help guide his sleigh through the storm and they did not have to cancel Christmas. Santa asked Rudolph, "Rudolph, with your nose so bright, won't you guide my sleigh tonight?" Rudolph was overjoyed. Santa put Rudolph in the lead spot, and off they went to deliver all the gifts and toys the elves had made. Rudolph asked Santa to stop and pick up all the misfit toys, and Santa said, "Lead the way, Rudolph." They delivered all the toys to the children around the world, and it was heard as they drove out of sight. Merry Christmas to all, and to all a good night. The end.